you have to be able to wake up every day and stand behind what you write. And that was probably the most formative thing that I could have learned as a young journalist.
That was Carrie Budoff Brown. She's the editor of Politico and the former managing editor of Politico Europe. We sat down for a conversation about her career in journalism, some of the lessons that she's learned. She worked at the local level and then moved up to one of the highest levels that you could get to as the editor of Politico. Stay tuned for this interview. Remember, listen carefully, think critically, and conclude thoughtfully. I'm Luke Scorziell, and you are listening to Bills. Today I'm in the studio with Carrie Budoff Brown, who is the editor of Politico, and she was the former managing editor of Politico Europe and a Washington correspondent for almost the entire Obama presidency.
Yeah, almost. I left Washington, though, in 2014, end of it, to go to Europe. So, yes. So I cut out the last 2 years of the Obama administration, which was a nice little break from America for a period of time before I came back to see through the Trump administration.
So we have you back in America now,
yes.
And we'll talk about that. Well, thank you so much again, though, for coming in.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. And before we get into the hectic political sphere we have now, I kind of just want to learn about you and what brought you into journalism. I think an interesting way to explore that would be to look at a moment that you said to yourself, I want to be a journalist. Mm-hmm. Was there a moment like that?
There was a moment of recognition that this would be the right career path for me. I spent a time with a lawyer who was 28 years old and I was, 18, and he was absolutely miserable. And that was a defining moment when I didn't want to become a lawyer. And it was literally like, if you're 28 and not miserable, then gosh, that's terrible. And then I think actually just a few months later, I ended up going into my local paper where I grew up. I grew up in New York, Pennsylvania. There were a whole bunch of young people who, these were reporters in their 20s because they took a lot of kids from Penn State at the time, and they were all happy and doing interesting work. And, all their job was to wake up every day and find out new information and have the right to ask for that information. And I even recognized that, at 18 years old, that, that's kind of a cool career to pursue if you get paid to find out information, write about it, ask questions, and then, figure out how to put it together in a compelling way. I thought, and get paid for it. I was like, that's kind of cool. I'll do that. So I do just remember that moment. And then I think, that was kind of defining for me. I was always a kid who wanted to, thought that I knew what I wanted to do or planned for that kind of thing. And yeah, so it was a key moment.
And I guess the second moment off of that would be, when did you decide that politics was the route you wanted to go down as opposed to something else? And then on a national stage too, because if you started in Philadelphia at your local paper and now you're at a obviously huge national media organization.
Yeah, and I think deciding when to be a politics reporter was also somewhat happenstance. When I was in my early 20s, I got a job at the Hartford Courant, which was a good regional newspaper in Hartford, Connecticut, and when I was going through the interviewing process, there was a female editor who was a senior editor at the paper, and she was asking me what I like. And I just mentioned offhand that I liked politics in addition to so many other things. And she zeroed in on that and said, "Oh, you're gonna be a politics reporter for me." And it was as blunt as this. She was like, "I don't have enough women covering politics." And I was like, "Okay, cool, let's go do that." And that is how I sort of got pushed in that track. And that was defining in that, I had one woman who sort of looked at me and I expressed an interest and she pushed me in that direction. And from there, I started covering the Hartford City Hall and then the governor and the legislature of Connecticut. And then again, another key moment when I was in Philadelphia for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it was 2006. And I was thinking, where does this lead me? And I read about Politico starting up. And before then, Washington was not sort of like a path that I expected to go down, but the fact that they're, national reporting and Washington was where there were opportunities. And I took it simply because of that. I wanted to be a journalist that worked at an organization that was not laying off people. And that's sort of where we were. And it was right before the, recession. And I jumped right before then. And luckily, I made a good bet.
And what were some of the lessons, I guess, and skills that you learned covering news for the various organizations that you worked for before Politico that then you brought into your experience reporting in Washington, D.C., covering the Senate, covering healthcare, and covering President Obama.
Yeah, all these things are building blocks. What I learned at these, smaller papers, I covered a beat, and covering a beat really teaches you how to be a journalist, because you have to go back day after day and back to the same group of sources to convince them to tell you things. And that really requires a very high level of, engagement with people, with commitment to accuracy and fairness, because you can't just write something and then you'll never see them again. That's not how it works on a beat, particularly in a small town. You learn that you have to be able to wake up every day and stand behind what you write. And that was probably the most formative thing that I could have learned as a young journalist, by trial and error. I didn't always succeed. But those times where I didn't succeed were very, educational for me. And being able to make mistakes in that kind of environment before you get to a, national news organization, where when you write something, it ends up, driving the cable news shows for the whole day and the nightly news, to really screw up in that environment is not one where you want to screw up. So I learned a lot for those good 10 years that I was just covering planning boards and zoning boards and mayors. And, that was foundational.
I think kind of picking up on one of the things you said of covering news in a small town is that you have the same sources. You maybe see them all the time. And I think that's something interesting for USC students right now, because we've had the national admissions scandal going on, which actually broke while we were in D.C. At Politico. What advice would you have for covering your own organization or your own community and having these sources that are people that you see all the time?
The same sort of operating principles apply no matter where you are, which is be curious, test your assumptions, always ask the extra question. Don't, if you're not sure of something, you need to pick up the phone or reach out and double check. There's nothing that's too small to try to get right. And don't surprise people. If you have folks you're covering or sources that you're writing about, it's not, when I say don't surprise people, it's not that you're going to call them up or give them a copy of what you're going to do before you publish it. You frankly should never do that. But you can do something where you call up the sources, particularly if you're going to sort of, hit them hard with something and say, listen, I'm in this story. I have 3 sources who are saying X, Y, and Z, and you sort of give them a chance to add in new information, but it also requires you to stand firm too, based on what you were planning to publish. And I think that has helped me in Washington, where, yes, covering the White House is like a very difficult, there's a small group of people who know what's going on, and you have to go back to them every day. And that was often something that I had to navigate as a reporter covering a place with a very small funnel of information. And yeah, learning that's really important.
Going back to your story, one day you're no longer in Washington, D.C., you're across the world in Belgium, in Brussels. Can you tell me about that transition? Was it planned? What was going through your head at the time? Did you just need something new?
Yeah, no, it was around my mid-30s, and I had wanted to, given that Washington wasn't my sort of big lifelong ambition, I just wanted to take a break from it, and I wanted to go overseas, and was lucky enough to go abroad for Politico. And it also coincided with this incredible series of news events that happened in Europe from when I arrived in early 2015, with the refugee crisis started hitting Europe, and you had sort of the Greek debt crisis, with Greece maybe leaving the euro and the EU, and then a bunch of terrorist attacks started happening in Europe of very large scale, Paris and then Brussels. The second one was right outside our office, and then you had Brexit. So even though the presidential election was happening in America, it almost seemed like when I went to Europe, some of the biggest stories in the world that were dominating headlines around the world were happening in Europe. So I felt very lucky to be in this place and time in the EU. And I left right after the Brexit vote and came back, and Donald Trump was elected here. So it remains one of my probably best professional experiences of my life.
Do you think you would ever go back?
Yeah, I would if I could. The European Union is a major government institution that's not covered very aggressively. And when you sort of bring American journalism to that environment, you adapt it so it's not so culturally, repugnant to people. But there's just so much opportunity there to do great journalism, and it's not that crowded. Whereas in Washington, it's so crowded. And in Brussels and really across the European Union, there's just great stories that, American media organizations just haven't taken that seriously. And so I just saw great opportunity and freedom there. So coming back here was a little bit bittersweet for me. Obviously, I deeply enjoy my job now and feel incredibly grateful to have it. But if I could have chosen a world where that opportunity didn't come when it did, I would have, because it was only 18 months, and I'm very proud of what we created there. So, and yes, I would love to go back at some point, maybe not to Brussels, but definitely overseas or Asia. I just see this sort of great opportunity. Politico itself is doing a lot of global expansion as well. I mean, I see it just is very intriguing to me to be outside of America.
Because you had experience being with Politico when the organization itself actually started in 2007.
Yeah.
And then you were the managing editor of Politico Europe as it got started there. So can you talk a little bit about what the difference was between creating Politico originally in the United States versus then having this entirely new branch of it in Europe?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. That is what I really loved about it, was the fact that I was able to try to start Politico for a second time in a new continent. Before we launched, people were saying, I don't need a daily newsletter to tell me what's going on. I'll just click on the FT and I'll read the papers. And then, within months, people are like, I don't know what life was like before. I mean, to your question, like, my instincts on what made a great story in America made a great story in Europe. People are fascinated by how decisions get made, who's behind it, the political forces that come into play. And people there in Europe, as much as America, want to know how big decisions are being made about their government. And if you provide that in a credible, accurate way, the market will respond. We were a year into having started our subscription service in Brussels, and our renewal rate was 93%. So 93% of the people who bought with us had renewed. And that was the first major indicator to me that this could survive in Brussels and in Europe. And now, granted, it helps that it was a democracy, that there's democratic institutions in Europe. We're trying to expand into Asia, particularly China. And it's just not the same set of, calculations that you're playing with. It's much more complicated.
So now we'll finally get back to you being in Washington again. What is it like to be at Washington now versus when you were there before?
Yeah, it's incomparable. The Washington I left in 2014 was completely unlike the Washington I came back to at the end of 2016. The number of major stories that you would consider major in any previous administration are multiple times a day. And at the first year, it was very difficult to sort of get your arms around and run a newsroom where you had to muster this sort of moment. How do you cover a moment every couple of minutes? and the thing is that still happens to the degree it happened in the early months and in the first year and a half. I think we figured out how to manage it better, and I think to a certain extent it's become normalized. The fact that you have major stories that in any other administration would dominate news coverage for days, and now it's may not even dominate a news cycle for an hour. And that's both. We don't know the long-lasting effects of that. Like, I don't know what it is. What I do try to bring every day is have a team of people that is big enough and smart enough to figure out how to do that. But I think all of us are struggling with how we do that multiple times a day, every day, as we do.
So then it makes your job very difficult in terms of finding out what to cover.
It does. Yeah, I mean, it's deciding where to place your bets, because we're all of us in Washington are just making decisions every day about what stories to pursue, when in fact, like, you could wake up the next morning and say, wow, there was like 3 major stories in my competitors, that sites or papers that I wish I would have had the resources to put towards, but we have to make choices. And, sometimes we make the right choices, and some days I wish I would have made sort of some different decisions. But it's just part of this environment, and one that, for at least the next 2 years and maybe even the next, 6 years, is our normal.
Another aspect of this kind of changed news system is not only that the stories transition all the time, but also that the information moves very quickly through Twitter, through Facebook, through text message, whatever. Your job is, I think you said in DC, is to keep the most informed people in the country informed. How do you do that in an atmosphere where information just travels at the snap of a finger across the country?
Yeah, it is. It's something that started happening, honestly, years ago with Twitter. The mandate for the reporters in my newsroom is that you have to find, I want something distinctive that hasn't been reported before, that's completely new information. And that doesn't happen all the time. There are things we have to report because, it's an important event, release, something like that. But it's always you got to do that really quickly and then put your attention towards a story that hasn't been reported, a bit of new information that hasn't gotten out there. You don't need to be the 5th, 6th, 10th news source on things that people already have on Twitter within a minute of it happening. And it absolutely has changed how we run a newsroom. But it's good because it's a good challenge. And when we meet it, I'm very happy about that.
And kind of winding down to the end, but you are a female editor of one of the largest news organizations in Washington. What advice would you give to female reporters who are looking to reach up to the highest goals?
Yeah, I would say that that any female reporter should figure out what works for her reporting style wise. Me coming up through Washington as a young woman, a lot of my role models, particularly at Politico, or I wouldn't say role models, but a lot of the examples I had in Washington at Politico was a style of reporting that didn't work naturally for me. It was a lot of bombast and yelling and cursing and bullying, honestly. And that's the style of a lot of male reporters. And it can be the style of female reporters too. In my particular newsroom, there was one style and it seemed to be valued above anything else. And it took me a while to figure out that I could be my own style and type of reporter, and I could be successful, and I could be as successful as the men. And it did not matter that my style was lower key or I didn't yell at people, or I just figured out how to get things in my own way. If I got to the same place as the men did, which I did, then I was okay with who I was. And I think it's about being yourself, not trying to be somebody else. And if you are yourself and you work hard, then chances are you're going to be just fine. But find your own model of reporting and writing. And it does not have to be like the one that you often see in movies or you often see in the newsroom you're in. Be yourself. That's probably more powerful than anything that you can do or model yourself after.
And finally, what is next for you? Do you have any idea what country you'll be in next, what you'll cover next?
Yeah, no, I'm at Politico through the 2020 election, and that's a huge undertaking for the next 18 months. I've been with Politico since it launched 12 years ago, so history would suggest that I would probably still be with them after 2020. But my ambition, and I think of my husband's as well, we do hope to make it overseas again someday. So if there is a job that would take me there, I probably would choose that over just about anything else. But honestly, I wouldn't want to be overseas right now at this moment. I do appreciate having this sort of seat that I'm at a place as good as Politico. So for the near future, Washington's where I will be.
Near future. But we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Luke. It was a great pleasure.
And again, this is Luke Scorziell with Carrie Budoff Brown, the editor of Politico. I hope you enjoyed that interview. If you did, then you'll definitely enjoy episode 50, which was with Jim Vandehei, who is the CEO and founder of Axios and the former CEO and founder of Politico. Additionally, I have episodes coming out every week with interesting guests. So if you want to head over to wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, wherever, go subscribe to Bills with Luke Scorziell. You can catch us on Twitter at Luke Scorziell and on Patreon if you'd like to support the podcast with a monthly donation of your choosing $1, $2, $5, $10, $20, $100, whatever you'd like to give. I'm grateful for it. So with that, I hope you'll join us next time. I'm Luke Scorziell, and you are listening to Bills.